So this is the Kung Fu Genius video where I rant about people ranting about Bruce Lee, and I also rant about that new documentary. All right, let's do this.
And every day I practice martial arts.
Watch out.
Word is I'm a Kung Fu genius.
Hey everyone, it's the Kung Fu Genius, aka Alex Richter. I hope everyone is doing well. I apologize for the hat, quarantine hairstyles and all. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about something that's very personal to me, which is Bruce Lee. I've noticed lately on YouTube, there are a lot of videos of people, especially from the MMA side of things. Sometimes they praise him and sometimes they decide that they're gonna bash Bruce Lee because people say that he's the father of MMA, or people say that he was so way ahead of his time, and then some MMA guy or whatever by the name of Ramsey Gordon or whatever has to say, oh, actually he didn't really know what was going on. He didn't really know that actually there were full contact fights already going on in Russia at that time. There was already Vale Tudo in Brazil, and then trying to look at Bruce Lee and criticize Bruce Lee through a 2020 lens for things that actually Bruce Lee fans are saying, which might be misinformed, but in a certain way, they're kind of making Bruce Lee posthumously, the ghost of Bruce Lee, defend claims and defend things that he never said. So this guy, Ramsey Gordon, Gordon Ramsay, whatever his name is like talking about the fact that during Bruce Lee's lifetime, there were already full contact fights going on. For example, in Russia with full contact Sambo or sports Sambo, and also things like Vale Tudo in Brazil, in which no rules fighting already existed. And if you look at Bruce Lee's notes, and if you look at the things that he was working on, his idea was to look at combat in its totality, meaning punching, kicking, grappling, all these kind of things, but he had limited access to certain things. But now in 2020, where we have MMA and we can see all of these things, we can easily go on YouTube and watch tutorials in any kind of fighting style that you want. Now they look at it and say, man, how come he didn't know about these things? I'll tell you why Bruce Lee didn't know about Russian Sambo or Brazilian Vale Tudo in the 60s. And that's because in the 1960s, Google really sucked. I think it's very important to look at people in their time period. For sure, when Bruce Lee was in the States, most of the martial artists he was working with, especially in the late 60s, were point karate fighters. Chuck Norris, Mike Stone, Joe Louis. And so it's easy to say, well, there was only point fighting karate going on at that time. So Bruce Lee was, the one-eyed man in the land of the blind telling these guys that maybe real fighting isn't like point karate, right? But then at the same time to say, because there were other countries that had real fighting going on and real fighting contests, that somehow that completely diminishes what Bruce Lee did. And this is completely ridiculous. Bruce Lee was helping these point karate guys get better. Doesn't necessarily mean that he viewed things from a point karate paradigm. And what people always forget, especially there was some blue check guy on Twitter who said something like Bruce Lee never sparred competitively, or Bruce Lee never fought for real, or any of these kind of things, and therefore he'd have no interest in the UFC. Bruce Lee could be an actor who's also really into martial arts, who would also have really liked UFC. And also he may not have fought in UFC if it existed, but that doesn't necessarily diminish anything that he stood for. There are plenty of experts out there, experts in MMA, who have podcasts, who never stepped in the cage themselves. But yet Bruce Lee somehow is held up to a standard that didn't exist during his lifetime, which only exists now. So retroactively, he's essentially being shamed for things he never even knew about. What's more ridiculous is you have guys who I really like, for example, Chael Sonnen, say stuff, well, Bruce Lee didn't really fight or whatever. So how much do you think Chael Sonnen really knows about Bruce Lee? So we're going to look back in the 60s and say, I don't see any video footage of Bruce Lee fighting. In what? The only thing that existed in the States was point karate, just like our friend Gordon Ramsay likes to let us know. Bruce had absolutely no interest in that, because anyone who's actually had any real fighting experience knows that that's not a real test of anything. That's just all that existed at that time period. When we look back at Bruce Lee's history learning martial arts in Hong Kong before he came to the States, we know that he had street fights there. Of course, this is all anecdotal. There weren't any video cameras there, but there are lots of eyewitnesses from people who trained with Bruce Lee and other people who talked about the fact that because he was always getting into fights, he was constantly at odds with the authority figures in his life. We know even in his first fight where one of his teachers, Wong Sun Leung, was there, at the very first, Bruce wasn't winning, and then he kind of came back and won the fight in the second part. So we know that Bruce Lee even had adversity, which meant that he had real street fights and real struggles. On top of that, at the age of 18, he won a boxing match against the boxing champion Gary Elms. And if people say, yeah, he was only 18, it was only one boxing match. Yeah, but still, if you say Bruce Lee never fought, and then you go, yeah, well, he had a boxing match. Yeah, he had a bunch of street fights. Then it starts to deteriorate at that argument. Yes, they weren't professionally sanctioned fights because you didn't have that back then. Fighting contests were not even really legal in Hong Kong until maybe the late 60s, early 70s. So Bruce growing up in Hong Kong in the 50s would mean that there were no sanctioned fights for him to go to. So to criticize Bruce Lee for not having any professional fights when he was in Hong Kong is ridiculous. They were none. And he actually did have a sanctioned fight, and it was a boxing fight. And that's more boxing matches, even if it's only one, than most people who criticize him have ever had. So that means that by the time Bruce Lee came to the States in 1959 or so, he had already had a number of street fights in Hong Kong, and he also had one official boxing match. After he arrived in Seattle, he had one very famous fight with a karate black belt. This happened in a YMCA handball court, in which Bruce Lee essentially destroyed this guy in less than 10 seconds. And then a few years later, he had his very famous fight with Wong Jack Man. And very shortly after that, Bruce Lee became a big proponent of fighting with all sorts of gear on, the gloves, the helmet, all sorts of things that people were not doing back then. Things that are kind of very commonplace nowadays for mixed martial arts, to fight with gear on, shin pads, gloves, elbows, all that kind of stuff. These were things that Bruce Lee was doing in the 60s because he felt the need for realism in training. And he felt that need because he had actual fighting experience. But again, to criticize him for not having official fights, where? In point karate, where would he have had these official fights? And again, he wouldn't have known about Valet Tudo or about Russian Sambo because Google really sucked in the 60s. But really easy now to say how much was going on when you can just Google it and find out. On top of that, we also know about Bruce Lee's fight on the set of Enter the Dragon with one of the extras who was a triad member. And on top of that, the most infamous of all of Bruce Lee's fights, the one with Lao Tai Chun. But let's just say he only had one fight in a boxing ring. You still can't say Bruce Lee never fought for real. And I don't agree that Bruce Lee was the father of MMA. I don't think that that's actually what Bruce Lee's focus was. And also, he never knew what MMA was because it didn't exist. He had an idea about training martial arts in a realistic paradigm, and he did it in the best way possible at that time period, given the tools and knowledge that he had. So it's very disingenuous, in my opinion, to look at him through a 2020 lens and then criticize him in this kind of way. First of all, he's not the one who made the claim that he's the father of MMA. If anything, it's Dana White. Or it's his misguided fans or people who just like Bruce Lee or people that don't know that the difference between movies and real fighting. Bruce Lee was someone who understood the difference. He just happened to become famous for doing movies, but that doesn't mean that he didn't understand what fighting was. So you have a big mixed message of people who are real fighters who are confusing some ideas about Bruce Lee as a movie star with some of the ideas that he had as a martial artist, which are like separate, like church and state. I think Bruce Lee would have been a huge fan of MMA. I think he would have really liked it. And I don't think there would have been this huge antagonistic relationship between MMA and Bruce Lee or any of this kind of stuff, because I think he would have embraced it. He would have been way too old to fight in it, but that doesn't mean he wouldn't have liked it. And then to talk about like, oh, Bruce Lee didn't know that much about what was going on in mainland China. That is 100% true, because mainland China wasn't really a place you wanted to know much about if you grew up in Hong Kong. And it's also a bit disingenuous to say like, oh, there was all this hidden secret stuff going on in China. The Shaolin Temple, the one that tourists flock to nowadays in China, was built in the 70s. It's a plastic fake temple, and martial arts do not come from that place that you go to when you go to the Shaolin Temple. The Shaolin Temple in China is faker than four-stripe Adidas. I believe you always have to look at people in their time period. You have to contextualize people's innovation given the time period that they grew up in. We have lots of people that we are now standing on their shoulders, and it's very easy to see the longer view because we are standing on the shoulders of people who paved the way for us. So you have to look at Bruce Lee's brilliance in the time period that he came up in. And he's still far ahead, certainly, of many traditional martial artists, and he's still very far ahead of people who really get stuck in the dogma of their particular styles. It would be the same as saying, well, if you took a prime Helio Gracie and put him up against Gordon Ryan would smash him. And that very well may be true. But there wouldn't be a Gordon Ryan, most likely, without a Helio Gracie. And so you have to look at people in the time period, look at what they did, given what they had, when they had it. And you cannot look at it through the lens now and compare it and say, oh, look at what they were missing. Because you can't do that in anything. You can't look at a car from the 60s and compare it to one today. But people are constantly doing this, and it's very unfair. Technology nowadays wouldn't exist without the older technology of which it was built upon. So to tear down the old technology because the new technology is better is completely ignorant. Yo man, how come Brazilian jiu-jitsu didn't use leg locks back in the day? How come they didn't like it? Well, that was the older jiu-jitsu. They weren't really into it, or maybe they didn't know it. But yo, catch as catch can. Wrestlers knew about leg locks way back in the day. How come the Brazilian jiu-jitsu guys didn't know about it? It's ridiculous to look at anything through this kind of lens. And look, I totally get it. There are Bruce Lee fans out there who think Bruce Lee would walk into the cage and wipe Brock Lesnar without even, flinching an eye or whatever. We know that that's not the case, but that doesn't diminish anything Bruce Lee accomplished in his lifetime. And all these kind of guys, this idiot on Twitter, Ramsey Gordon, whatever this guy's name is, they're trying to diminish someone who's essentially the inspiration for a lot of people who do martial arts nowadays. And I almost forgot this whole thing about whether Bruce Lee would beat Muhammad Ali or whatever. There's someone who answered this question already. It was Bruce Lee. He said, and first of all, Bruce Lee had nothing but respect for Muhammad Ali. So this whole idea who would win in a fight. So Bruce was someone who was well aware of his limits as well. It's his fans who are misguided who think that he can beat everybody. Which brings me to the next topic, the Be Water documentary. Now, this one is a little bit difficult for me to talk about because I personally know a few people who worked on the documentary, and also I'm Facebook friends with a couple of people who worked on it, even though I might not know them super personally. So when I criticize this documentary in any kind of way, this is not to be a slight to anyone who worked on it. I, for one, know how difficult it is to put a project together like this. I've been working on a documentary project myself. It's tremendously difficult. And kudos to anyone who can actually put a project together and get that thing shown and get that thing played and get that thing distributed. That's amazing. But having said that, and perhaps because I do know some people who worked on the documentary, I was actually aware of this documentary about 2 years ago. And how am I going to put it? From what I was told about the documentary 2 years ago, I was so excited about it. I thought this was probably going to be the best, the final masterpiece that could be done about Bruce Lee, given the collection of archives, given all the people who were involved. I thought this was really going to be the best vision of Bruce Lee's life ever put to film. And unfortunately, a lot of the interviews that they did for this documentary did not get played in the final cut. I was super excited to see Angela Mao get into the documentary. She doesn't really speak English, so they had her in Chinese with subtitles, which was amazing. One thing I thought that was a little strange about the documentary is that all the people who talked about Bruce Lee, they did them mostly in voiceover, so you didn't see anyone's face who was talking about Bruce Lee. In addition to that, and not to be repetitive, there were a large number of people who were interviewed, especially Chinese people who knew Bruce Lee intimately, who did not get into the final cut of the documentary. And it's very disappointing because the documentary pointed out that, one of the reasons perhaps why Bruce Lee did not get the role in the Kung Fu TV series was because of his Chinese accent. And then there was a fear that the American audiences at that time were not going to embrace someone with a Chinese accent. It seems very disingenuous for the documentary makers to make that claim and then literally cut out tons of Chinese interviews that were made for the documentary. It seems that their accents were perhaps a little bit too much for the ESPN documentary. So on that point, I felt it fell a little flat. Of course, any good Bruce Lee documentary is going to talk about the tremendous amount of racism that he faced when he was in Hollywood. And this is 100% the case. The difference in pay on Green Hornet between Bruce Lee and Van Williams was staggering. And the struggles that Bruce Lee had to really break into Hollywood, and the fact that he had to go to Hong Kong to kind of go in through the back door, this is all part of Bruce Lee's story, and we're all very happy to hear this. But I felt that the documentary actually didn't even tell that part, the really difficult part of his life. I don't feel that they told that part of his life very well. There are other documentaries about Bruce Lee that I felt told that part a lot better. And this documentary was being championed as the one to talk about his struggles and what he had to face. In fact, of all the Bruce Lee documentaries, I would rate this one, unfortunately, as one of the worst. Now look, don't get me wrong. If you're a normie, you're a casual Bruce Lee fan, or you're kind of new to Bruce Lee, I'm sure you'll think it's great. And if you've never heard anything about Bruce Lee before, it's a great primer. Hell, for me, it was super cool. The one thing in the documentary I liked was that I heard Amy Sambo's voice, who was Bruce Lee's first girlfriend when he came to the States. Never heard her before. But other than that, there were things they even recycled from other documentaries in that documentary. And it just fell flat. The best documentary about Bruce Lee is one that's not openly available. At the Hong Kong Heritage Museum, they have a display, an exhibit about Bruce Lee, which has a lot of his personal artifacts and things there. It's really fantastic. It's closing this year. I don't know if they're extending it because due to the pandemic, but they probably have been closed for a very long time. But when you go to this exhibit at the Hong Kong Heritage Museum, they have a documentary there. It's about an hour, and this documentary interviews everyone. His American students, you see Guro Inosanto, you see all of his American students, obviously Linda, Shannon, all of them, the usual suspects. But then they interview a lot of people that Bruce Lee knew growing up in Hong Kong, even people outside of the martial arts circle. So the stories that they told were very rich. And we all know how every Bruce Lee documentary ends, so there's no shocker as to what happens. But I've seen this Hong Kong Heritage Museum documentary 3 times, and every single time at the end, I left with a tear in my eye because it's told by people who really loved him and people who were very close to him. The ESPN documentary just fell a little flat. It was the first time I had ever watched a Bruce Lee documentary and was bored. And I love Bruce Lee. I geek out about Bruce Lee. When that new footage came out last year with Bruce Lee on the bicycle with the suspenders, I freaked out. When it turned out that there was footage of Bruce Lee at Sharon Tate's funeral, as macabre as that is, Bruce Lee just walks by really quickly and you see him, I geeked out. So it's not like I'm not totally into this stuff. But Be Water was just disappointing. It was flat. And it lacked heart. It didn't have the heart that other documentaries have. If you want to see a good Bruce Lee documentary, watch Warrior's Journey, or even watch the super old Golden Harvest, Bruce Lee the Legend, or hell, even watch Death by Misadventure. They are far superior, even if they're not as technical. There were tons of factual inaccuracies in the documentary, stuff that's like kind of been told so many times that people just believe it. The Kung Fu TV series was not written with Bruce Lee in mind. Bruce Lee did have the chance to audition for it, but ABC didn't really want any Asian actor in the lead. That's why the other Asian actors, Mako, George Takei, they were also all turned down for the role as well. And other things, of course, all respect to Robert Lee, Bruce Lee's brother, but Bruce Lee did not begin learning Wing Chun because he needed to defend himself from bullies. He learned Wing Chun because he wanted to be a better street fighter. Bruce Lee did not train James Garner. He trained Steve McQueen and James Coburn. Bruce Lee was mostly apolitical during his lifetime. He always had aspirations of being an actor. Even when he went back to visit Hong Kong in 1964, he just kept them secret until a little bit later. And as a matter of fact, if you really want to get a feel for what Bruce Lee was like, warts and all, you should read Matt Pauly's book, Bruce Lee: A Life. There is no better cradle to grave biography about Bruce Lee than Matt Pauly's book. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what I do here, please subscribe to the Kung Fu Genius and hit that bell for notifications. All right, guys, again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.